If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is something you have seen or experienced in your life that has made you believe in paranormal things? I was 8 years old, in my 50s now, and staying overnight at a neighbor's home. I was sleeping on the carpeted floor of a finished basement, and there was a chair in the room about 4 feet behind me. I woke up suddenly and turned over to face the chair, which was now on its side on the floor. There was a woman kneeling behind the chair with her arm on the side of it and her chin resting on her arm. She had long, dark, straight hair and was obviously sitting there watching me sleep. I thought it was the woman who lived there. When our eyes met, she let out a sigh, and I mimicked her sigh. Her lid lifted, and then her entire body floated up and into the ceiling and disappeared. I fell back asleep, and in the morning, the chair was still on its side. It had been upright when I went to sleep originally. That was it, but no one could ever convince me this didn't happen. No one can convince me there are things we just don't understand out there. That is all. My mom and I lived in a trailer when I was about 13. Every night, we would hear singing. We could never understand what it was saying, but it kind of sounded like a music box. It was a girl's voice, how cliché. At first, we were confused but never really scared. After a while, we didn't think anything of it. About a week later, we're talking to our neighbors, and we find out they used to live in the trailer we did. The first thing they asked was, "Have you heard the singing?" Of course, this was kind of creepy. From this point on, I've always been a believer, at least to an extent. This could have a logical explanation, but I never found one. This happened recently to me, 33 m. When I was young, my family lived in a house in which I always thought strange things were happening, hanging pots and pans clanging, and other things that could be ambiguous as to whether it was just house noise or something else. One night when I was around 8 to 10 years old or so, I woke up at around 2 to 3 a.m., and I always left my door cracked to let some light in. I looked towards the door, and I saw a perfectly black silhouette of my sister walk in and go towards the dark corner of my room. I said, "Alyssa, what are you doing? Go to sleep," and my eyes adjusted, and there was nothing there. Fast forward 20 years later, and by this point, I have more or less dismissed this event as just my childhood imagination. I was talking to my grandmother, who lived in the house before me. My family doesn't really talk about paranormal stuff as they see it as silly, so I've never brought it up, but I decided to this day and asked her if anything strange ever happened to her at the house. And she said, "Oh yes, I saw a demon in the house." I asked what it looked like, and she said, "A completely black figure walked into the living room, walked to the corner, and disappeared." My jaw dropped, and I immediately got goosebumps. Apparently, this was only one of many things that happened in the house before they. Let me start by saying I come from a deeply religious family where we never spoke about the paranormal. That being said, I've had many different experiences in my life that cannot be explained. Before my husband and I moved, we were in a newer townhouse, and we were only the second or third tenants. There were several times I saw different things or even experienced voices. My stepson would even tell us that his friend Charlie came to visit at night. One night, when it was just my husband and me home, we were together talking in bed. I started to hear a quiet whistle, like a song. I had asked my husband if he could hear it, but he had suggested it was just the wind. About 5 minutes later, we had continued our conversation, and I had a blinding pain in my head come out of nowhere. At that moment, my husband heard the whistling. We both stopped and looked at each other. Only for the whistling to stop and the sound of footsteps pounding up our hallway stairs. My husband ran outside our bedroom, there was nobody there, and my sudden headache went away. Normally, I would think it was a nightmare, but both my husband and I had heard the whistling, the footsteps, and then the pain. When my mother heard about what happened a few weeks later during a family dinner, she pulled me aside and let me know that I needed to be careful because I had always been sensitive to the other side. Needless to say, this specific experience has always stuck with me. So I was told I've had unexplainable things happen to me since I was a child, as told by my parents and other family members. But what made me full out believe it was probably when I was maybe 11 or 12. But a couple friends and I were walking home and decided to cut through a park. The old manor and grounds were turned into a park. It was probably around 11-ish. The manor itself is said to be haunted, mainly the basement, anyway. We decided to walk through the park. As we were walking, all three of us started to get the feeling that we were being watched. We all kept looking behind us to see if anything was following us. We didn't notice anything, so we kept walking, but we started hearing weird noises, and almost everything sounded like whispers. I was slightly freaking out at this point, knowing that the manor is haunted. We start walking a little bit faster, and one of my buddies decides to look back and is like, "WTF is that?" My other buddy and I looked and noticed what looked like something standing on top of a stone pillar standing at us with its arms folded. The park is enclosed by a big black iron fence with about 12 to 15 foot stone pillars, so we start hustling, but not quite running, because we think, what if someone is messing with us? Constantly looking back as we walk, it looks like its head is moving, following us. So now we are creeped out walking and looking back, and now it has moved several pillars forward but is still behind us watching. We start to run constantly, looking back to see where it's at. As we were running, it moved 3 more times before we made it to the exit, and as we were running halfway down the street, we stopped and looked, and we could still see it at one of the stone pillars. So all 3 of us see it, and one of them is still a close friend, and we talk about it from time to time. I did the Ouija board with my 2 friends, A and B. Friend B didn't want to do the Ouija board because he didn't believe it, but me and friend A were asking the Ouija board questions, and we were getting answers. We asked when we would lose our virginities, what we would be like when we got older, etc. For me and friend A, the Ouija board, the spirit's name was Hunter, would give us reasonable answers, which all wound up coming true, when we asked questions about friend B, who didn't want to play the Ouija board but seemed to toy with him. It said he was going to lose his virginity at 25 and was going to be a garbage man. Friend B thought we were messing with him and said, okay, ask it a question that only I know the answer to. We asked, what was friend B's cousin's name that died in the war? The Ouija board spelled out the name, and my friend started crying. Crazy shit. It was one of the most surreal moments of my life. I used to explore abandoned buildings with a friend and went through numerous, including an old hospital that turned into a psych hospital before closing in the 1960s. Considering its history, you'd think this would provide some convincing experiences, and while we definitely felt certain energies and heard sounds, footsteps, scuffling, that upon investigating were definitely not people or animals, I never saw anything there that was super convincing. However, we found an old indigenous war fort a little bit of a drive out of town. It's a well-known place locally, but we thought we would check that out one night. It was a clear night with lots of moonlight and heaps of visibility. We were walking around the grounds of the fort, and then both me and my friend saw an entity, pitch black against the otherwise well-lit backdrop. We both froze as it quickly made its way towards us. My friend exclaimed, "Duck that," and we both ran. It made no noise and was definitely not a human. I can only best explain it as a void of light that had no features other than being roughly human shape and size. We went back the next day, and there was definitely nothing physical that we could have mistaken this for. Given the amount of moonlight and the fact that I could see my friend as normal, it was a super well-lit night, and this entity made no noise. It was definitely enough to convince us. If I saw it alone, I would probably talk myself out of believing what I had seen. However, the fact that we both saw the same entity in the same way at the same time was definitely enough to convince me. Many personal experiences. I grew up in historic houses with unsavory histories. One that's notoriously haunted was being renovated basically the whole time I grew up. I lived next door and my parents owned it. The first time I heard something in there, I was 5 or 6. I went in by myself to get my bike helmet. I was on the first floor and heard heavy footprints walking on the 3rd floor or the attic. I had unlocked the door when I went in, and the house never had hobos in it. Over the next few years, I had 2 different friends see a figure in the windows of the house. And I heard the footsteps many more times. I also learned last year that around the same time I first heard the footsteps, my half-brother, who was in his 30s at the time, was in that house alone and saw me. He told me he said hi, but I just walked away and ignored him. He went back to the house I lived in, and I was sitting at the kitchen table eating. He asked how I had gotten there so fast, and I didn't know what he was talking about. He also lived in the house prior to the renovations, as did my parents, and they all have stories. Then, by the time I was in high school, the house we were living in had become pretty active. Footsteps in the attic. Chairs moving around in rooms nobody was in. Doors slamming. One night I woke up and looked at my alarm clock across the room, and a 6-7 foot tall shadow was standing by my window. A few months later, I was the only one home, everyone else was out of town. I got home late from a car meet around 3:45. I laid down and was woken up 15 minutes later by the 8-foot tall solid wood pocket door in the hallway next to my room sliding open, then sliding all the way back closed. This door was heavy enough that I struggled to move it. I lay there terrified, listening for footsteps, but there weren't any. I was too scared to open my eyes or make any movements. I eventually fell back asleep. I've had many experiences with knocking, objects getting moved around when no one else was even in town, scratches, and a figure standing at the edge of my bed staring at me. I've also experienced other things while out, That would be a cryptid, but the very first ever paranormal experience that I can recall involved my cousin and me. We were little, maybe 8 to 9 years old. Some older kids taught us how to play a game. Later, it was learned that it was essentially a seance. Things got pretty serious during the game, so we decided to end it. We gained a lot of information from it. This is shortened by a lot, but at the basement door that leads to the front door, only one could be opened at a time. A faceless lady in a reddish pink shirt, who was described during the game, walked from the basement door through the front door. We also ended up doing research, and her information was confirmed. She died the way she died, and it was right next to the house. She was friendly, but it just sort of creeped us out that it was actually working, which is why we ended the session. I never played it again. I don't go looking for anything really, but I've had a lot of things seek me out, it seems, even in my dreams. When I was 9, maybe 10, I got really scared trying to sleep one night. So I ran to my mom's bedroom and told her I couldn't sleep. I stayed with her that night. It must have been a couple hours later when I was awakened by a bright light in her bedroom. My mother did not wake up. I looked over her shoulder, and I saw a white figure kind of hovering over her or right next to her. I do not remember seeing wings, but she appeared to be female and looked exactly like my mother, but years younger in appearance. She had her hands folded, and she was smiling down at my mother. She then looked at me and smiled at me. I did not get that feeling of calmness. I felt terrified. I remember rubbing my eyes really hard and burying myself under my mom because I was scared. I didn't want to look up again, but I needed to know if this was real or if I was imagining it. I slowly peeked up again, and she was there. I was scared and frozen. I was too afraid to run out of the room, plus I was in the safest spot in the world, by my mom. I stayed really close to my mom and tried waking her up. I whispered, for fear of startling it, to please wake up. Wake up. I said something was here. I didn't know how to explain it. My mom just mumbled and kept sleeping. I then closed my eyes really tight and never opened them again the rest of the night. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I avoided looking in that direction entirely. I even remember putting my hand over the left side of my face as a shield to avoid looking at that side of the room. I ran out of the room and down the hall. It wasn't until around midday, maybe a few hours later, that I was brave enough to look back down the hall and into my mother's room again. As I brought up the courage to look back at the room, I saw a somewhat large blob of what seemed like gas. I knew then that I had not dreamed of this. There it was, not as a figure but as a gas-like object. I didn't bring this up to anyone, not even my family, for years. When I was about 15, my brother and I were having a conversation, and we brought up our past. I mentioned this to him for the first time. What shocked me was his response. He saw it too. When I was in high school, I had a lot of these experiences. At the house my dad lived in at the time, it was really old, built in the early 1800s, there were plenty of times I'd be sitting in the living room and distinctly hear the cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen. It was just me and my dad that lived in the house, and you could clearly see when his bedroom door was shut and he was asleep, but you could still hear it. Normally, my dad worked 7 to 3 but occasionally worked a PM or overnight shift. One night he was working until 11, I was 17 at the time. Around 8 or so, I'm sitting in my room playing Borderlands, and I think I hear footsteps coming from the living room, which was adjacent to my bedroom, and assume my dad is home early. Go back to playing Borderlands. I keep hearing the steps, so I pause the game and listen, and the footsteps are just slowly pacing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen in a steady rhythm. I laid in bed, scared SHT, and actually counted the steps. Every time, it took 15 paces to the living room and 15 paces back to the kitchen. Needless to say, I did not ducking sleep that night. I was 2 when my grandfather died. I woke up in the middle of the night to see him at the end of my bed. This is the first memory I can recall. We talked all night, and in the morning I apparently repeated nearly word for word his and my mother's last conversation before he passed. I was being babysat by my grandmother when I saw 3 American Indian women in full regalia in our home. They looked really nice, and I told my mom about them. Apparently my grandmother had seen them too, but she said they weren't happy she was there. I had this teddy bear I'd had for years that I'd always leave in my grandmother's room. She lived with us at this point, and I'd usually leave it on the floor as a kid, and she'd always prop it up on her bed. She died when I was 11, and I moved into her room. One night I got up because I couldn't sleep, and my mother was the only one awake. We watched TV for a couple hours, then I went back to bed. That teddy bear was sitting straight up on the edge of my bed, which was only a twin, and it was on the side I had to get out of. It gave me the absolute creeps, and I forced my mother to get rid of it. Also, I lost a child while pregnant 5 years ago, the only ones who know are a couple of my best friends and my ex. Well, my mother volunteers at a huge historical cemetery in our area, and they had a medium and some paranormal guys tour the place a couple years ago. They went to dinner afterwards, and he asked about her daughter. She'd never mentioned me once. He apparently guessed my age, which is weird because my mother was 37 when she had me, so it's a little strange to have a child my age, and he asked about my son. She said I didn't have a child, and he said, "Then who is this little boy about 2 years old that I see walking with her everywhere?" My child at that time would have been exactly 2. When I was 14, I agreed to look after my neighbor's cats while they were away. They left me a key to their house, and I was supposed to go over once every day to feed the cats and check on them. But when I was walking over the following evening, I saw an older woman in one of the windows of the upper floor, staring at me. I got a little confused and turned, walking back home, thinking that maybe I had mistaken the day or if they had someone else check on the cats. The next day, the same thing happened. I walked over again, and I saw the same woman staring at me from a window, but this time on the first floor. I called my neighbor then, and they got worried and told me to call the police because no one was supposed to be in there. I called, and the police came, but the house was empty, except for the cats. I stayed in the house while the police left and fed the cats. I left soon after. I came over and fed the cats as I had promised, but the whole thing gave me the creeps. I never saw the woman again. But the cats refused to leave the living room. In our old house, there was a lot of really creepy stuff that happened. My son wouldn't go to sleep until we told the boy in his room that it was time for bed and that he needed to go home. We kind of got used to that, and I figured he was just ducking with me. Cut to 2 weeks before we move. From my daughter's old bedroom, there was a long hallway that led through the master bedroom and into the living room. As I'm changing my daughter's diaper, something catches my eye, and I happen to look towards the master bedroom. There I saw, or thought I saw, the most unbelievably beautiful woman I have ever seen, next, of course, to my wife, with long, flowing brunette hair, pouty lips, and a red dress that hugged her body perfectly. I looked back down at what I was doing, not registering that this woman was in my house. I double-checked not a second later, and there was no one. I finished my daughter's diaper and walked through the house, and there was no one there with us besides me, my daughter, and my son. I mentioned it in passing to the landlord when we handed in our keys, and he said that a woman fitting that description and her young son used to live in the house when it was built in 1934. He knew the family well, as he had bought the house from them. The woman and her son were both killed when a storm tore through town, nearly demolishing the house. Guess that explains who I saw. I was probably around 11, and my family and I were going to a friend's wedding. The wedding was at Elkhorn Lodge in Colorado, pre-renovation. It's actually in the same valley as Stanley. This property had many uses before becoming a lodge, and with the rich history came ghosts. I didn't believe it at first, until all of the kids who were at the wedding started to hang out and exchange stories. Everyone was staying in the lodge, and I was staring into a cabin on the property as the wedding had so many guests that we filled up the lodge itself. About 6 of us were in a room with the door to the hallway open. The door slowly shut, but we didn't think anything of it, as we all figured another group of kids were trying to scare us. Then the room became icy cold, and the water in the sink started a steady stream. We were all frozen in fear, as there was no way some could do that. We then heard a sound that can only be compared to someone jumping or falling to the floor. And just like that, after the bang, the water stopped, and the room went back to a normal temperature. This experience changed the way I think of the paranormal. There's too much that I still can't explain today. I've never really experienced anything paranormal in my life. I was fascinated with ghosts and the afterlife, though, and I always wanted an experience. I got my wish around a year ago. There was a car crash right beside my house on a corner. A 5-year-old kid passed on the site, and his house was 4 houses down from mine. I remember around 3 or 4 weeks after the crash, my friend came down, and we walked down to his house. It was around 9:30-ish, and we passed the kid's house, which the family abandoned not too long after the crash. We talked about how crazy it was to lose your life that young, and then I noticed a light on in one of the house's rooms. Pretty weird, there's no car in the driveway, and the family left the house not even a week after the crash happened. We shrugged it off, went to his house, grabbed some stuff, and went back up the road to my place. We passed the house again, and the light was off this time. Then we both heard a whimper or cry of some sort, and we took off running. I told my friend to slow down because we were running to where the kid died in the crash. When we walked past it, my heart felt like it dropped, and I immediately wanted to cry. I felt so upset, and I was getting goosebumps and chills all over. Then I felt a slight touch on my hip, and I just took off running to my house with my friend, asking what's wrong. All this happened at around 10:30 p.m., at the same time the crash happened. I don't know what happened, but it was still an interesting experience nonetheless. This was not the first paranormal encounter I had in this home. I sold the house a few years ago. One night I was watching TV in my living room, and I left to go upstairs for a minute. It was a divided staircase, and when I got to the landing, I saw a black cloud moving down the open, upstairs hallway. It was about the height of a person, and it was changing shape as it traveled. I stopped in shock and stood there, watching as the cloud disappeared at the end of the hallway. Then I heard some chanting coming from my living room. I went to see what it was, and it was coming from the TV. It was much louder than the volume at which I had left the TV. The TV screen was fuzzy, like that in the movie Poltergeist. I had not seen that in years. Modern televisions do not do that anymore when they lose a signal. I immediately turned off the TV. I wish I had waited to hear what the chanting was, but I was freaking out and wanted it to stop. When I got my composure back, I went upstairs, confused and somewhat in disbelief. In the upstairs hallway, where I had seen the cloud, there was a roll of toilet paper rolled down the hallway. The spindle in my hallway bathroom was empty. Back in 2011, me and my mom lived in these old ghetto apartments. I didn't like the place because it just didn't feel right, especially my room, so I did whatever I could to sleep in my mom's room. I was about 4 or 5 BTW. After living there for a while, I started seeing this shadow that absolutely would not go away. We tried everything. We moved all my stuffed animals and toys. We burned sage. We checked to see if it was just the paint, but it wasn't. That's when it got worse. I started hearing things. Whispers. Knocks. Footsteps. It had just gotten to the point where I was just too afraid to be in my room at all. My mom then did some research and found that someone had gotten shot and killed in my room just before we moved in. A while later, we moved out of there because I just couldn't take it anymore. The weird thing is, the place caught fire a day after we finished moving out. True story. This happened like 15 years ago. It was the school holidays, and my friend, we'll call her Sarah, and I were extremely bored and just wanted to chill. This was summertime, and we lived in a small town called New Braunfels in Texas. Everything was kind of spread out. Anyway, it was around midnight, and we didn't know where to go. So we just decided to go to the park. It's a little big. We were there for an hour or so. Nothing unusual. Until we both saw someone or something crouched on a table. First off, it's a little weird that someone else is in the same park at this time. But what's creepy is that this person was crouching on top of a ducking table. He wasn't even sitting on the bench. What really messed me up was that, because I didn't look away, I kept looking closer, I noticed that there were wings. The body was completely human, but it had ducking wings. The part that I'll never forget. All of a sudden, the most blood-curdling scream, like a woman being stabbed to death, sounded like a woman but unhuman at the same time. Like a scream, which a normal person doesn't do, but a scream animals can't even make. It's almost like those screams in a movie that a demon or something makes. Then it just stands up, and this ducker has to be 8 feet tall, minimum. We both ran as fast as we could. Have you ever run to your lungs' maximum capacity? I ran until I had no air left in my lungs and then kept running until I had to slow down because I was coughing too much. We knocked on people's doors and kept getting threatened that they had guns and would shoot if we didn't leave. We were literally locked outside with this thing. I kept looking into the sky, because this reminded me of Jeepers Creepers in the movie. After maybe 20 minutes the police show up and, of course, think we're on drugs. But I wanted to let us go. I walked the rest because I lived a few blocks away. The police drove my friend home. There was a white cop and a Mexican cop. When the Mexican cop heard the story, he pretended like it was just made up, but the look on his face said he knew something about this thing that nobody knew. I have PTSD now and hate going outside alone at night, especially near parks or the woods. Weird people don't really scare cops, and animals don't really scare cops, but you know it's much worse if a cop lies and can't keep a straight face because of fear. Like I said, it's a story that happened, and I remember it as clearly as day. But this is a story nobody believes. It all started around 8 years ago. I was 10 and home alone. My parents were out with my sister watching some theater, nothing important. I thought I was ready to be home alone, but I had no idea what was hiding in that house. So my parents had ordered pizza, and everything was good, but then I heard a noise upstairs, like something was walking around. We had no pets, and there was nothing that could have made that noise. I went upstairs to see what it could be. I should say that our staircase isn't that old but makes a lot of noise when you walk up and down, like it's going to break or something. When I got upstairs, there was nothing to see, everything was as it should be. I went back to the staircase, and I saw it, a shadow. I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. I got so scared that I started crying. I didn't know what to do, but as soon as I made a noise, the shadow was gone. I cried a little more and then went down again. We had an old phone back then, and it was downstairs, so I had to go down to call my parents. When I got down, I was shaking. I ran to get the phone, and as I pushed the buttons, I saw it, a black mass standing in the kitchen. Not a shadow, but this mass, or whatever it was. It was black. All black but in the shape of a human, a very tall human with long arms. Its arms or the shape of them went all the way down to the floor. When I saw it, I quickly got under our sofa and hid until my parents came home. I haven't seen it since, but ever since that day, I've felt like following or watching it everywhere I go. And lately, it's gotten worse. I can't sleep. And if I'm in a dark room, I almost feel attacked by something bad. I don't feel safe anywhere. I don't want to know what it is, I just want to escape from the living hell. One night, my then boyfriend and I decided to take a little trip to Reno for a night. Kind of a getaway from our boring little town a few hours away. We checked into our hotel and began a nice night of drinking, partying, and gambling. Eventually the partying got the best of us, and we headed up to our room for the night. I had a hard time sleeping since it felt like the sheets were made of sandpaper. Just a side effect of our earlier fun. But at one point, I remember waking up a bit dazed still and seeing a very tall, black figure in the corner of the room where the window and the wall came to a corner. The curtains went from the ceiling to the floor and almost all the way to the wall. I figured that it was just the wind moving the curtain around, even though the figure seemed to be much darker. I just went back to sleep because I couldn't remember if either of us opened the window before bed, and it was probably just the drinks and pills playing tricks on me. Fast forward to about 6 months later. I am now 6 months pregnant with our son at this point. After watching top 10 scary ghost sightings together, I brought it up that night to my boyfriend. I finally told him what I saw that night. I had never mentioned it before to anyone. He told me that he actually saw the same thing and even tried to wake me up because it freaked him out, but I wouldn't wake up. This has, by far, been the creepiest thing I have ever experienced. Once, when I was 11, I was alone in my grandparents' house. I think it was around 7 or 8 p.m. when it happened. My grandparents' house is a 2-story one, with their room being right above the living room, the second floor being made of wood, which makes a very distinct noise whenever anyone is waking on it, and the stairs plopping you right into the living room next to the couch that is in front of the TV. Also, where they live is very noisy, and there's a bus going up the street every hour. Keep these details, they're important. So I was watching TV when I heard what sounded like a light thud on the second floor, but since there was nothing else, I thought it was either my imagination or the noise came from one of the neighbors. A few minutes later, I heard it again, much louder now, like there was actually someone walking up there. I knew it couldn't be a burglar because the only window on the second floor that anyone could use to enter the house had bars, and it was already closed and locked. The sound kept going as if the person was walking in circles, so I went upstairs to check, using a cushion as a shield just in case. I was 11, shut up, turned on the lights, checked the room, but nothing. I checked the whole second floor just to be safe but found nothing odd or out of place, so I went back downstairs to the TV. Around 1 or 2 hours later, it came back again, this time so loud that it was real. It felt like it was in my ears and upstairs at the same time. No matter the noises from the street or the TV, I could hear perfectly, and now I was truly scared. The steps also got out of the bedroom. I heard them perfectly getting out of the bedroom, no noise from the door though, pause at the corridor, and come down the stairs. I sat there frozen in fear, hugging the cushion while the steps came down. When the person came to the part of the stairs where the wall ended and you could actually see who was coming, the steps stopped. I rushed to turn the stairs on, and, thank God, I saw nothing, but after a while, I swear, I heard the steps going back upstairs. Because when the adults got back home and I told my mom, she said it was just my imagination, but it was not. Also, no, I wasn't watching a horror movie or anything. I was the very definition of a crybaby and a scared cat as a kid. Anything horror was a big-ass nope in my book. Also, to finish the story, about 2 years after that, I went to my bedroom to grab something and saw a tall man with a shadow-like figure with 2 white dots for eyes and a silhouette that looked like an overcoat. I haven't seen, heard, or experienced anything like those moments in that house ever since. Well, the only thing I have seen is that, about 2009, we were on the highway from Manzanillo, Mexico, to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and I was lying on my back, in the back of the Jeep Wrangler, open roof, and then I saw a light. It was steady at first, but brighter than the rest, then it moved slowly, forming a Z shape in the sky, and at the end of the Z, it came back to the left faster than its previous movement, and then it just flew to the right really, really fast, until I lost it. Then I saw another light do the same backwards, but instead of going back to the right and then flashing out to the left, it just kept going slowly to the left. After that, a shooting star passed from right to left in diagonal to the movements of these lights, which may be totally unrelated. This light might have a natural explanation, IDK, but the fact that they did those movements and that it was a Z and a backwards Z almost at the same time brings me to doubt that it has a rational explanation, as does the fact that about 2 weeks later I saw another light moving in a strange manner in PV. Anyway, that is more UFO and less paranormal, but in my book, all these things fall into the same category of things that exist that official science does not want to because they don't fall into the laws they make and they make them feel uncomfortable. Now, honestly, I've always believed in the paranormal or extraterrestrial, so my grandpa never spoke about such things, but my grandma is a firm believer, as are my mom and aunts as well. My stepdad is the kind of guy you'd never think believes in this stuff, but he also does, and both my granny and my stepdaughter were deep into paranormal stuff. They both say they were witches, and they both believed in little people, and stated that they were mischievous, annoying, and little pranksters, and that they didn't like being seen by humans, which, considering how deranged and divisive our kind is, doesn't come as a surprise. I used to be a hardcore atheist, but now I'm somewhat spiritual and a full believer in the paranormal, mainly thanks to 4 experiences. First, I was 11 years old, staying at my grandmother's house for the night, and I was up at midnight watching TV on low volume in the living room. I got up to go get something from Grandma's kitchen, which is literally 15 feet away from her living room. And when I came back, my drink was moved to the other side of the table, which is the kind of lighthearted prank my deceased grandfather would do, and it was just me, my mom, and Grandma in the house, and they slept like logs and weren't pranksters. Second, I currently live in a mid-century modern house built in the mid-60s with my father. On several occasions, I've heard loud, heavy footsteps in the attic, and when I inspected it, there was no one. Now keep in mind that on the old wooden attic floor, human footsteps have a very different sound than house-settling noise or animals, so I know it couldn't have been a raccoon or something else. The third, and probably the most terrifying, is a woman whispering in my ear when I was lying in bed. A female voice whispered "help me" into my ear, and I literally felt hot breath on my ear. The scary part is that I was wide awake, my eyes were open, and I would have seen someone kneeling down in my ear. There is nowhere to hide in my bedroom, and my door was locked. If it were just the voice, I would have dismissed it, but feeling actual breath freaked me out, and I can't explain it. Fourth, I was physically attacked in my sleep by a shadowy hat man figure. I had a dream that this figure was standing at the foot of my bed and jumped on me and started strangling me, so I started punching this thing as hard as I could to no avail. Suddenly, I woke up, and in real life, midway through throwing a punch, my hands and neck were sore, like I had been strangled and I had been punching something. This one really freaked me out. When I was 7 or 8, I lived in a generic, suburban, middle-class neighborhood. The kind that you would never suspect anything to happen paranormal-wise because of how new it was for its time. This was probably around 2004. There was a family we knew pretty well who lived there, not far from us. Their kids were older than us, in middle school and high school. My brothers and I always went over there to play Halo 2 and GTA since we couldn't own M-rated video games. Also, their dad was a truck driver, so he was gone most of the time. So it was the kids and their mom at the house more often than not. One night, my dad, a former Marine, got a call from the mom around midnight saying they thought someone had broken into their house. She was pretty frantic and asked if he would come over with his 9mm and go through the house. He cleared the entire house from top to bottom. He checked every possible place he could think of but found absolutely nothing. He only told me that part about a year ago. At some point after this, I was over there hanging out with their oldest son, who was in high school. It was mid-afternoon on a sunny day. We were listening to the anthem by Good Charlotte and playing Diddy Kong Racing on the N64. For context, he had a massive entertainment shelf, that's the best way I can describe it, the kind that has drawers on the bottom, a cutout in the middle for a TV, and cutouts above it. It had about 2 feet of room between it and the ceiling. Out of nowhere, the TV cuts to static as if someone had ripped the cables right out of it mid-game, which no one had. As soon as that happens, the entire entertainment shelf begins shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't coming off of its corners, but it was more than vibrating. All of his trophies fall off the top and land at our feet. This probably happened for 5 to 10 seconds. Then it just stopped as if it had never happened, like at the snap of a finger. As soon as it stops, we hear really loud, Heavy footsteps coming from the ceiling directly above us. They sounded like work boots. Also, we were on the second floor. At this point in my life, I still thought ghosts were people under white sheets, so I turned to him and asked, "Do you have rats in the attic?" Remember, I'm probably 7, and he turns to me and says, "No, I don't think it's rats." A minute later, his younger sister walks in and says, "Did y'all hear that? It was my evil spirit." And walks away laughing. She was completely joking, by the way. I think at this point, they were just used to it. About 2 weeks later, they had a priest come bless the house, and then they moved out shortly after. I never heard from them again. I have had other things happen to me, but that was the first and most definitive experience I have ever had by far. I believe my childhood house is haunted. During the night, toys would go off, TVs would turn off and on, and strange things would happen, like things getting moved around, and we would hear different noises throughout the day that didn't make sense. I shared a bedroom with my little sister until my older sister finally moved out and I moved into my own bedroom. That made it so 2 of my brothers shared a bedroom, and then my younger sister also ended up with her own bedroom. One night after I recently moved into my new bedroom, I was trying to sleep. It was almost 2 in the morning. I kept tossing and turning, I could not find a comfortable spot. I finally just laid on my back and stared at the street lamp just outside my room. I started feeling even more uncomfortable. I had this eerie feeling. I got this feeling every once in a while through the years of living in this house. I decided to ignore it and try to force myself to sleep. I looked at my door, which was lit up by the street light, and saw a black figure shaped like a tall man. It was clear as day because of the light. I froze. I didn't know what it was, I could just feel it staring at me. I didn't want whatever it was to know I saw it, so I didn't make any sudden moves. Looking back now, I don't know how I remained so calm. I closed my eyes, hoping it wasn't coming close to me. After what seemed like forever, I started calming down. I opened my eyes, and I didn't see it anywhere. I felt a huge relief knowing it was gone. I definitely couldn't sleep after that. I thought that it could have been my mind playing tricks on me because I was so tired. I closed my eyes again, and my door swung open. I peeked, not knowing what it was. It was my little brother. He looked in the room and then left. I was weirded out by this. I didn't know what he was looking for. I didn't get any sleep that night. My alarm went off at 6 a.m., and I started my day. Exhausted, I was definitely thinking about playing sick so I wouldn't have to go to school. I'm glad I didn't. My brother and I walked to the bus stop together every day. On our way there, he asked me if I was awake around 2:30 a.m. I knew that was when he came to my room, so I said no. He said, "You promise you didn't do it?" I was lost in his questioning. I looked at him, confused and a little scared by the way he spoke. "Promise I didn't do what?" I said. He replied, "I was asleep, and something pulled me out of bed. I swear it was you. All I saw was a shadow heading towards your room by the time I turned around." I was terrified. So was he. He's younger than me, and I didn't want to scare him any more than he already was, so I didn't tell him about the black figure I saw just before that happened. I also told him he must have fallen out of bed and was dazed and confused when he woke up, and I told him to forget about it. I will say that was the worst experience he or I had. Over the years, nothing that dramatic ever happened again. I and my sister shared an experience that we will never forget. When I was around 7 and my sister was 9, my family moved into a house that was beside a huge cemetery. I'm talking about thousands and thousands of bodies buried there. Along with a mausoleum that had probably 100 or so people in it. You couldn't see our house from the road, it was hidden by trees. So our driveway was long, and as you drove up our driveway, you could literally read headstones. It was convenient for my family at the time because my dad worked at this cemetery as a grave digger. As young kids, my sister and I weren't scared of this house or the cemetery. We hadn't really ever been exposed to the idea of paranormal things yet. We would actually spend a lot of time walking around the cemetery and the fountain that's there. We would also go visit our dad while he was at work. But my parents were kind of off-putting about the house once we started living there. I remember them mentioning how there were holes in the corners of the rooms, like the previous owner had cameras in the house. But as kids, we didn't really get why that would be weird. My mom lived with us at the time. We called her a nanny. She had strokes in the past and was kind of frail. She couldn't walk that well and needed assistance doing certain things. She was just really weak from her strokes. But at this point in time, her mind was still sharp. My nanny's room and my sister's room were connected by a bathroom. So each room had a door to the bathroom. One day, my parents went to the grocery store and left us with my nanny to watch us. It probably wouldn't have been a good idea to do that, but my sister and I were pretty well behaved. We wouldn't do anything bad or give her a hard time. My sister and I were sitting in the middle of my sister's room, playing on the floor. All of a sudden, the bathroom door, which was closed, started shaking violently. It seemed like someone was grabbing the doorknob and shaking as hard as they could. We immediately got up and went to my nanny. She was sitting in her room, watching TV. We stayed in her room until my parents came back. I know for certain it wasn't her, because she would have said so. Even then, there's no way she would have been able to shake that door like that. She was just too weak. My sister had other things happen in that house. Like figures peeking in at her through the crack in her bedroom door. We would also see a little girl with black hair, most of the time not even inside our house. Mostly outside, around our house. That's the only paranormal thing that I have ever experienced. But to me, it's significant, especially because I wasn't the only one to witness it. And my nanny was there to verify it wasn't her. My first experience was when I was 6, but I remember it vividly. And so does my mom, because the following morning I talked to her about it, and she told me to never talk about it again. She's Caribbean, and typically, we believe talking about it only makes things worse. So basically, my parents divorced, and my mom and I moved into this house. I had a daybed. The kind you can make look like a couch and stuff. So bars are on the back and sides, but the front is free. Basically a twin-sized couch. I was in my room, with boxes everywhere. Nothing hanging up and a window in front of my bed, offset but important. I was born in 1994, so this is like 2000, so I didn't have a phone to scroll on or anything. I'd just look around the room and think until I fell asleep. This is before the Game Boy Color had a backlight, and I didn't even have the light for it, so I was really just laying down with all my thoughts. I was never afraid of the dark until this happened, but the light from the window was pretty bright because there was a street light near my window. So I'm looking around, trying to fall asleep, and scanning the room, not for anything but going from left to right. Then I looked to the left, and something was there. It wasn't tall or anything. It was bigger than me at 6, but not by much. It was perched on the end of my bed frame like a frog, and because it was in front of the window, it was just a silhouette. It didn't move or make any noise, but it just felt evil. It looked like it had crazy hair when I was younger, but knowing what I do know, it looked to be about 16 horns. None of them were straight. They were all curled. It just sat there and watched me. I had 3 options. Turn on the light and see it. Call my mom, and it jumps on me. Run, and it jumps on me. So I just covered my head with the blankets and didn't move at all. In the morning, I was completely covered in sweat. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't want to check on it. Really oppressive energy. I told my mom, and that's the beginning of this. My grandparents moved us into a house that was built on land that used to hold apartment blocks, which people in my city refer to as the dampies. These apartments were thrown up without insulation to house impoverished people with zero concern for their welfare or safety. Due to this, a lot of people died. When we moved in, I was only 3. By the time I reached 6/7, my grandparents sat me down and explained to me that we are not alone in this house, and if we leave them alone, they won't harm us. That was true for the most part. I heard strange things almost constantly and saw strange things such as a computer chair spinning rapidly on its own or seeing and feeling the depression beside me as though someone had sat down next to me on the sofa. I was around 14 when I first saw anything of real significance, as I was raised to ignore and grow used to the strange things going on around me. A woman who looked very much like my grandmother is over 6 feet tall, so she is quite distinctive, came into my room and turned both the TV and radio on full blast. As I thought this was my grandmother, I started screaming at her. The figure walked out of the room, and a moment later, my grandfather came through to ask what was wrong and reassure me that my grandmother was sleeping. About a year after this, I was staying there with my dog, who was around 9 months old at the time. I like to play games, so it's no secret that I will be up and around from 12 to 7 a.m., as that's my preferred time to play. Around 5 a.m., I was in the bathroom when my dog, who was sleeping, came to the door and started crying and clawing at it. She'd never done anything like this before. I opened the door, and not only was my dog in the hall landing but also a little boy who'd I'd say was around 8 to 10 years old, filthy clothes on, holes in his shoes, skin so pale, and eyes so black, he looked like he was on his deathbed. He didn't say anything to me, he just stood there looking at me, and I felt a wave of grief and sadness like I'd never felt before. I felt as though I could feel everything this little boy was feeling, and it broke my heart. The next day, I sat my grandparents down and asked them if we could arrange holding a seance to help him pass over and to help the others, which by that time we had all seen. We held the seance, we learned his name, age, that he was frightened of the woman who I'd seen, and that he had a cat called Blackie who we had seen multiple times and had dogs react to as if it were a flesh and blood cat. We were told the little boy and another man we weren't aware of had been helped to pass over, but the woman was lingering and would not go. I don't think she is demonic, but she has very dark energy. She likes to play with people, and I've even had her pull eyelashes and eyebrow hairs out of my face. The activity has lessened considerably since the sighting, but she is still there, and you can feel her in 2 specific rooms of the house. They have a dark and thick feeling, whereas the other rooms feel light and airy. I've never been a non-believer, but I do consider myself very lucky to have had this experience, as it solidified in my mind what I already believed in. I was like 6 years old when my grandma died. I'm an Indigenous woman from Canada, so I guess you can say I was raised with awareness of spirituality and our oral teachings. I was also baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. I had a very clear memory of traveling north with my parents when my grandmother died. We have used the same funeral home for generations, so they agreed to meet us at 7 a.m. The funeral director let us in, and my mom was holding my hand because I was scared and also really curious, and she probably didn't want me to break shit. So, we were going past visitation rooms, and I looked in one and saw an old woman and a man in rocking chairs. The old man was reading a newspaper. They both looked at me and waved, and I waved back. I remember my mom giving me a quizzical look, and after we were done, she asked me who I waved at. I said to the old lady and man and asked her if she had seen them too. She said, yes, of course I did. Many years later, she told me the funeral director was the only other person in the funeral home. No one was there. It's our belief that children float between this world and the other until about the age of 7. I guess I could see them because I was still so small. But I remember it very clearly to this day, and I'm in my 30s. I saw a spirit one more time, and my mother believed it was her brother. Most of my encounters happened through dreams. My father is a policeman. A no-nonsense guy who lives very much in the here and now and believes only in what he can see, feel, or hear himself. At the time of this story, he was in the police force for more than 20 years, and I was a teenager. My father worked night shifts, and on a regular basis, he would come home in the early morning to have breakfast with us before he would go to bed and we would go to school. He would usually be in a good mood and tell us funny or interesting stories from his day, or night, at work. This morning, he was unusually silent, and he didn't eat either. My mother asked if he felt all right. It took him a while to actually answer, and he said, "I'm not sure what I experienced tonight." He didn't want to say anything anymore in front of us kids, but we prodded him long enough until he told us the following. It had been a quiet night, and he was out with his colleague in a police car. At some point, they were informed over the radio that a car chase was going on not far from them and their assistance was required. They drove off towards the chase and soon caught up with the suspect's vehicle. The radio had informed them that 2 men were in front of the car. My father's car pulled up almost beside the car so that he could get a good look inside. He saw the 2 men in the front arguing heatedly with each other. And he saw another man in the back. He had no hair and was so pale that he seemed almost white. He was dressed all in black. And he looked directly at my father, his face almost pressed against the window, with very dark eyes, and he grinned widely. My father was deeply unsettled by this person. He seemed to look directly into my father's eyes. My father was so sure of this third person that he informed the other police cars about him. The chase ended with the car crashing into a fence and the suspects fleeing into a field. They were apprehended only a few minutes later. There were 2 men. Not 3. My father asked all his colleagues at the scene if they were sure there hadn't been another guy. Nobody else had seen the third man. "I can't explain it," he said to us. "I saw him as clear as day, and he grinned at me like death himself." This took place in 2004-2005 in Germany. To this day, we have no logical explanation for what he really saw and experienced. I never believed in the paranormal. Not so certain now. 1988, 3 a.m., alone except for my dog, and sound asleep. I hear 3 very loud knocks on my front door, which is right next to my bed. I woke up and bounded to the door in 3 steps. My dog was already at the door, in alert mode, and listening. I looked out the peephole in the door, expecting to see a cop. Nothing there. Then I realized that my door was inside a gated courtyard with 6-foot-high brick walls, and the gate was locked. No one could have run off without being seen or heard climbing the gate. 2005, 4 a.m., a 22-year-old son is home from college, and I am awakened by 3 loud knocks. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once. I got up and checked out of the house. Nothing. Later that morning, my son gets up and says, "Did you hear the 3 knocks last night?" I said, "Yes, it is the second time that I have heard knocks around 3 a.m. I consulted a respected psychic, and she said that it was Grandpa checking on you and that he looks like you. My mother died in 2011. In 2014, I dreamed that I saw her face against a black background, and she said, "You are going to need a bigger patio." I woke up and said to myself, wow, that seemed real. I went about my day thinking about the experience. 2 weeks later, my son calls me and asks if he can store some weightlifting equipment at my house. I said okay, and he said he was on his way. He arrived with 2 friends in a large flatbed truck loaded with equipment. They unloaded the equipment onto my back patio, completely covering it. I watched as they filled the last remaining space on the patio, and I remembered the dream and instantly understood its meaning. My mom just let me know that she still exists. Age 10, it's summer, and I am home alone around 6 p.m. watching TV. A stack of books on a shelf above my bed shot off the shelf and landed in the middle of my bedroom. 2 a.m. I can't sleep and don't want to disturb my wife. So I go sit on the couch in the front room in the dark. The couch faces a fireplace with a TV in front of it. So, as I am sitting, I am looking at the TV. The TV is off. The screen is black. Behind me, over my right shoulder, is the doorway into the hallway, which leads to a bathroom to the left and our bedroom to the right. As I am sitting there in darkness, I notice the movement of a reflection on the black TV screen. I focused on the movement, and it looked like the reflection of a thin woman dressed in a white flowing gown floating smoothly left and right in the dark hallway door opening. The woman was just moving in the hallway left and right towards the bathroom and then towards the bedroom. I watched this for about a half hour and would look over my right shoulder into the hallway and see nothing, but when I looked back at the TV, there was the reflection of the white apparition floating back and forth. I got bored and went back to bed. My family owned this house from 1952 to 2012. There was always a presence in the house. My mother was often visited at night by the spirit of an Indian. She said that he would just stand next to her bed and stare at her. She also visited my orbs, with faces floating around her. We knew that the area was home to Indians. My mother believed that our house was built over an Indian burial ground. When I was 8 years old, my family moved into a new house. I had numerous experiences there growing up, but the very first one still sticks out in my mind as something I am positive I experienced but cannot explain in any non-paranormal manner. We had been living there for just over a year. It was a couple months before my 10th birthday. Up until this point, it had always just been weird feelings of being watched, or something you put down in one spot but it shows up somewhere else, that kind of thing. Anyway, one night I had been asleep for a while when I was awoken by the sound of a man and a woman arguing loudly. I heard dishes breaking. It sounded like doors or cabinets slamming, just a huge ruckus. Now, my parents weren't the kind to have big knockdown dragouts like that. When they did argue, though, they would go back to my dad's office at the far end of the house, which was attached to the kitchen, which was where this sounded like it was coming from. It was literally as far from my room as my parents could get, because they didn't want me to hear them argue. Despite this, occasionally I had overheard raised voices late at night, so I assumed in this case that's what I was hearing. Being a precocious kid, I decided I was going to go get a drink of water, go in there, tell them off for waking me up, and also find out if they were breaking dishes. I left my bedroom and headed down the hall towards the family room, kitchen, and office. As I walked down the hall, the sounds got louder. I wish I could remember anything that was being said, but I was young and tired, so I just remember distinctly a man's and a woman's voice. I could see that the lights were off in the family room, which was odd if they were up, but I didn't think much of it. I stepped into the family room, which is attached to the kitchen, and could still hear the yelling. I turned on the light, and it stopped. Instantly. Like in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a banging cabinet door, it was suddenly completely silent. I was obviously confused, but from where I was, I could see that the kitchen was dark and no one was in there. I still walked over and peeked into my dad's office, just to be sure, but it was dark and quiet as well. Shaken and confused, I got my glass of water and headed back down the hall to my room. My parents' bedroom was at the very end of the hall, so before going to bed, I tiptoed down and peeked in their door. They were both sound asleep, snoring, obviously having been in bed for a while. I remember it feeling like all the hair on my body stood on end. I ran back to my room and jumped into bed. That was the first truly unexplained experience I had in that house. It was 30 years ago now, and I still remember that feeling when I realized there's no way my parents could have been in the kitchen yelling. I feel it is worth mentioning that my parents' house in Southern Illinois, US, was built by a well-known gangster from the area. The house actually belonged to the right-hand man of a gangster named Frank Buster Wertman, who is locally infamous. Anyway, my parents knew when they bought the house that the man who had owned it, Elmer Dutch Dowling, had been executed gangland style in a back alley of a nearby town, so we knew that a violent death was connected to the home. My folks actually bought the house from his widow, so we were only the second family to ever stay there. The Dowlings had daughters. I experienced way more things than my little brother, but I never thought much of it until I witnessed my daughter having an experience, while my son never had anything. My mom says it's because he only appears with little girls since they remind him of his own kids. I don't know if that's true, but it gave me goosebumps when she said it. My grandparents' house has had poltergeist activity since 1970. It started when my mother and her two sisters, Louise and Teresa, were playing around in a cemetery. I know, what were they playing in a cemetery? You got me by the ass on that one. My mother apparently forgot about the age-old don't walk on the actual grave's asshole rule while they were playing hide and seek and was running from Teresa. She stepped onto a grave, and the ground gave way, and she fell into the grave. According to her, the grave was from 1907 and bore the same name as hers. They scooped some of the dirt out, took it home, and got out their Ouija board. Jimi Hendrix had just passed away, and her older sister decided she wanted to contact him. They decided that the best way to increase the power of the board was to sprinkle the grave dirt around the board, light some candles, and turn out the lights. Jimi Hendrix did not answer them, obviously, but a woman named Amy did, and she apparently thoroughly chastised them for being naughty girls. The planchette immediately moved to goodbye. According to all three women, the room was silent until the wind picked up outside and blew around the outside of the house in such a way that it sounded like a shrieking woman and a moaning man all at the same time. There was no wind in the room, yet the candle flames instantly went out, and the lamp on the bedside table switched on by itself. All three girls ran screaming out of the room and hid in their father's bedroom, between the wall and the bed. After they calmed down and no longer felt threatened, they discussed what should be done next. They went back into Louise's bedroom, where they had been performing the seance, brushed the dirt into a linen handkerchief, retrieved the board, retrieved salt and matches from the cupboard in the kitchen, and went outside. In the backyard, they said the Lord's Prayer while holding hands, sprinkled the board and grave dirt with salt, poured gasoline on the items, and burned them. They went back inside, feeling like this was over, and tried not to think about it anymore. Nothing happened for a few weeks, until the youngest, Louise, began having terrible nightmares, to which she would wake up screaming several times a night. My mother was next, followed by her older sister, Teresa. My grandparents, both very quiet and not the type to tell tall tales, described the upcoming months as nights with no sleep, rushing from one room to another, flicking lights on and off, falling into bed after soothing one daughter, drifting into sleep, only to be awakened by another screaming girl. This went on for several months and then stopped abruptly. Just as my grandparents were beginning to feel well rested, Louise began screaming for her mother and father in the night again. "There are people in my room." According to Louise, she would wake up because she could hear people talking, and when she would open her eyes, the bedroom lights would be on, and there would be a man and a woman standing in the corner of her bedroom, sipping cocktails and having discussions about the weather. My grandmother started sleeping in bed with her now 16-year-old daughter. For the first few days, nothing happened, then my aunt poked her awake in the middle of the night. Grandma opened her eyes and looked around the room, seeing nothing and hearing no noises. When she began to ask Louise why she woke her up, Louise grabbed a fistful of her nightgown and said, "Shh," and then the lamp on the bedside table turned itself on. My grandmother jumped out of bed, grabbed Louise by the arm, and dragged her into my grandpa's bedroom. She woke him up, told him what happened, and they both slept in his bed for the next several weeks until Teresa, now 18 and going off to college, moved out, at which time they moved Louise into Teresa's old bedroom. There were more things that happened over the years, but they slowly tapered off into an every once in a while thing once they moved Louise into another bedroom. Now, 47 years later, that bedroom is like a time capsule. My grandmother used to clean it weekly, but they never moved anything out of it except Louise's clothing. All the furnishings have stayed the same, and after years of refurbishing every other room in the house, that room still has pea green shag carpeting and orange and gold owl wallpaper. Since Grandma died 10 years ago, no one has really bothered with the room, except for the occasional cleaning it gets when there's one too many extra overnight guests and someone has to sleep in there, and no one ever makes it all night. We almost always wake up to find this person sleeping on the couch. At night, when no one is in the room, you can hear people talking, a lot of people, like there's some kind of party going on in there, coming from that room. As a child, that room was the source of nightmares. All the older cousins would play tricks on the younger ones to force them into that room, only to lock them in. I myself was locked in the closet when I was 7, but that's a whole nother story, until their cries for help attracted adult attention, or even just the standard "you're too little to play with us. You have to stay in the back bedroom for 5 minutes alone if you want to play." There've been small bouts of activity throughout the home over the years, but it's really just something that everyone is used to, and for the last 35 years or so, that room has just kind of belonged to them. Growing up and spending summers at my grandparents' house, you could always hear what sounded like a party going on in the back bedroom at night after my grandfather had gone to bed. You could never really understand what they were saying, though, and the closer you got to the bedroom, the quieter they seemed. My older cousin actually locked me in the closet in that room when I was about 5. I say locked, but all she really did was close the door. I don't remember why I couldn't get out of the closet, but I remember trying to open the door and not being able to. I didn't want to yell for help because, A, that would make me a chicken and she wouldn't want to play with me anymore, and, B, it would get her in trouble and she wouldn't want to play anymore. So, I sat on the floor of the closet with my back to the wall. It was quiet for a moment, and I heard footsteps outside the door, so I thought she was finally going to let me out. But she didn't. According to her and everyone else in the house, she had gone outside to ride her bike. I heard the wire coat hangers start moving back and forth across the rail on their own, scraping back and forth, and then an old doll fell off the top shelf and landed in front of me. It was the kind that had the little sound box inside it, and when it landed on me, I looked into its little plastic face, and it said "Mama." I started screaming bloody murder and pounding on the door, and my grandfather came to the rescue. I remember hearing him run down the hallway and seeing him sling the door open. It was really traumatic for me, but probably not as traumatic for my cousin. He made her sleep in that room by herself that night as punishment. She has pretty much hated my guts ever since. I was walking with my buddies to another friend's house around 1 a.m. one night. We had been drinking a bit, but the night was young, and we were carrying on elsewhere and making our way down a long county road that was adjacent to some wide open fields that extended off into a distant forest. It was a clear moonlit night, and I remember feeling very clear-headed and enjoying the night air as we walked. As we walked along, I was casually drinking in the scenery in a way you only can at 1 a.m. on a cool moonlight night and looking off into a field. As I slowly scanned the area, I noticed something extremely dark, maybe 150 meters away. While the whole field was practically shining with moonlight, with light cloud patterns throwing bits of shade, this thing was as black as could be. It looked like a mass of obsidian, Vanta black, that was low to the ground. It was like something had an impossibly black blanket or shroud tossed over it, and it seemed to be very slowly moving in a drifting, shuffling kind of manner. I remember staring at it for 5 long seconds before I felt like I was jolted and realized I was looking at something very wrong. As the moonlight swept across the field and moved and the clouds played across the field, this thing was just there, looking like a total absence of light, just pure blackness shuffling slowly low to the ground. I watched it with shocked fascination until we walked past the field, and I lost it. I felt like I was too stunned to say anything and only brought it up when we got to my friend's house. All my friends ribbed me, laughed at me, and said I was skunked for seeing SHT in the dark and that I didn't see anything. They didn't even let me describe what I saw. I pretty much got out that I saw some ducked up shit in the field, and they were like, leave it alone, man, we don't need that tonight. A few minutes later, my friend GF came over to me and quietly said that she saw something strange too, that she saw something very, very black that looked incredibly strange and out of place. I told her I saw the same thing and thanked her for making me feel sane, and we never ended up talking about it again. Back when I was 7 or 8 years old, I'm currently 31, I woke up at around 3 a.m. needing the toilet. I got out of bed, headed to the bathroom, and took care of business. Upon exiting the bathroom, I noticed something rather inexplicable on the staircase, just a few feet to the left of the bathroom door. A sliver of pure white light no more than 5 to 6 in length and probably only a few centimeters in width was bouncing up the stairs in a slow, methodical manner. I stood in silence watching this thing, utterly transfixed. I quickly came back to my senses as the light reached the top of the stairs, turned toward me, and began to take its first bounce in my direction. I became suddenly and acutely aware of the strange nature of this encounter. As I assume any self-respecting 7-8-year-old would do, I ran back into my room and hid under my duvet. Fortunately, sleep must have taken me almost immediately, because the next thing I knew, it was broad daylight. I've had a lot of weird things happen in my life, but that one stuck with me because, to this day, I have no rational explanation for whatever it was. Oh, and I cannot stress this enough, I was fully awake. This wasn't some kind of dream, and I wasn't sleepwalking. I was every bit as conscious as I would be throughout any given day. Very strange. Well, when I arrived in Mexico, I was about 11 or 12 years old. I went to live with my aunt for a few years in a big, nice, 2-story, 3-bedroom house. Let's say my aunt got on a few people's bad side, and those people were fans of witchcraft, black magic, and all that stuff that tried to find logical explanations for once they happened. My aunt and her husband left for a small vacation to Mazatlan, and just me and my 2 cousins were left in the house. One morning, we found a black rooster dead outside the house. We didn't think anything of it and just cleaned and got back to business. That night we heard the front door bust open. It was a heavy door with metal frames. You'll probably need some tools to bust that baby open. My female cousin, 12, whom we'll call AC, came crying into my male cousin's, 9, room, we'll call him JC. Being the oldest man in the house, I took it to myself to check what was going on. So I lead a scout down the stairs to see what's going on. If you look just right from the stairs, you can see straight to the front door, which is intact. Well, the moment I reached the ground floor, all the lights went out, and the kitchen cabinets started shaking, opening and closing, slamming shut. We ran back to JC's room and shut the door. Armed with what we had, a few dressers, a laundry basket, and a 2x4, we started hearing someone running up the stairs, scratching the door, going into AC's room. We had pretty thick walls, and hearing how something sniffed the room and tore it apart. The lights came back on, AC was crying her ass off, and JC was paralyzed by fear. The temperature became very chilling, you could taste the tension. I was so pale. We decided to play Halo 3 to try to drown out the noise. We turned on the TV, which turned off a few times, but after a while it started working. We must have passed out, but when we awoke the next morning, my aunt had already arrived and had people checking the house. We moved out and went to my grandma's house, which has a few stories to tell about some good scares and some legends about the house. A few weeks later, I overheard my aunt saying something about a portal in her bedroom that was welcoming something. I think they took a priest to clean the place. And that's about it. I do generally try to explain away experiences as much as possible, but sometimes shit is just straight up weird, and I have no explanation for it. I've also lived in probably haunted places pretty much my entire life out of sheer bad luck. My current apartment has 2 ghosts that I'm pretty positive are there. Maybe a third, but I'm not entirely sure. All of them wander around the apartment and regularly go to the 3rd bedroom that we use as storage. I've seen a headless guy walk towards me while I was sitting in my bedroom, doom scrolling, and completely awake. My dad had seen that same guy walk through the wall behind our TV in the middle of our evening snack time, in the middle of a conversation. One time, in the middle of the night, I tripped over something knee-high in the hallway when there was literally nothing there. Like I did the whole knee smacked against something lumpy, foot drag, awkward side shuffle thing after you walk into a chair or a table sort of thing. I thought it was the vacuum cleaner, but nope, the hallway was completely empty. I watched the bathroom door open, close, then open again and thought it was my mom, only to find out she was on the opposite side of the apartment talking to my dad. I heard frustrated sighs and whispers randomly during the day in random locations. Honestly, it just feels like we're living in a space that's overlapping with another dimensional space occupied by a newlywed couple. It's pretty weird, to be honest, but not particularly scary. Just confusing and occasionally a little bit eerie sometimes. I was born and raised in the South. Rural Georgia, to be specific. Less than an hour from Savannah. It's a very spiritual region. You grow up with Baptists, and you learn that there are some otherworldly forces out there that can protect you or do you real harm. An example of the former, when I was really young, we had a tornado come through in the middle of the night. Me and my little sister slept through the whole thing on the couch with our new puppy, Guinevere. The following morning, it was pure devastation everywhere. Trees down, lines down. A fallen trunk had crushed my aunt's car clean in half. But there wasn't a scratch on our little trailer. It was like a barrier had been placed around us. Like some benevolent force had raised a hand and stayed away from us so thoroughly, the raging storm never even woke us up. Now, for an example of the latter, my mother is one of those empathic things. She doesn't necessarily see dead people, but she can feel it when that spiritual pressure begins to build. For years, when I was young, she would be bedridden all the time with migraines and immense headaches. She and my dad didn't tell me why. Why would they? But they believed there was a lot of energy coursing through that backwoods area. I told them once that the hall window made me nervous at night. The next day, my dad had a NASCAR flag pinned over it. It wasn't until years later that they told me about the thing that had it out for us. Looking back, I understand it now. Some of those bad entities can be detected when you can sense them. The one on our land knew, and my mom could tell where it was. Lurking at the edge of the yard, the hall window at night. And it didn't like that very much. It would target my mom specifically. It was part of why her head hurt all the time. It would take her paper plate out of the trash can in the closet at night and leave it on the counter for Dad to find. That kind of thing. One night, my dad encountered it for himself. He woke up in the middle of the night and was having a smoke in the kitchen when he noticed something through the window. He stepped out onto the front porch, and there it was. A black shape is just sitting on the edge of our trampoline, a few yards beyond the reach of the porch light. He told it, firmly, to beat it. Leave. Stop messing with his wife and kids, and leave us alone. It responded by rearing up at him and making a snorting sound. Challenging him as if to say, "And what's you do if I don't?" My dad bolted back inside. I moved here to Alabama when I was 13. That place is a distant memory now. But my experiences didn't stop there. Since 2012, I've been an off and on volunteer at the local museum complex. Two of them. One is natural history, and the other is a world history museum full of antique weaponry founded by a married couple of old World War II spies. My experiences are from this museum. There are thousands of items in the collection. Only 13% of it is on display at any time. The rest is in the basement. My mother, now the registrar at these museums, has her office down there, right beneath a massive shelf loaded with antique bronzes. Staring down at her. Joy. Now, I said the museum was founded by World War II spies. As such, it is overwhelmingly interesting and are clandestine antique weaponry. Many of these weapons have tasted blood before. It stands to reason that energies or spirits are attached to any number of them. We have no way of knowing. But there are several entities that live in the basement where my mom works. They have different personalities. One is a casual observer who lives inside a giant wooden Buddhist statue. The kind with the square hole in the side to insert prayers. Bodhisattva Guanyin? Pronounced like that. Another is a joker who likes to move things. Once, me, my mom, my sister, and one other volunteer were taking inventory. We had the huge wall vault of weapons open, moving items in and out. My sister goes to put a crossbow back in a corner of the vault. When she turned around, an old can of survival water that had been in this corner had moved. It was then on the floor. In the middle of the aisle. Behind her. With the label facing directly at her. She thought one of us had done it as a joke. We were all the way over at my mom's desk. Lastly, there's the mean one. He doesn't like you. He doesn't like anyone. He is a being of invisible, concentrated hate and malice. My mom calls him Big Nasty. He will push over dangerous weapons near you. Or, more commonly, he will rush you. You won't see anything. But you'll be able to feel a dark, evil freight train of rage barrel from the far end of the basement, right up to you, and just stop, towering over you and seething with contempt. He likes to do that when you're turning the lights off. Real charmer, that bastard. Then there's the stuff you do see. Once, I was coming down the stairwell to the basement door. It's the same kind of double door you see in schools, metal, with the rectangular window reinforced with crisscross wires. As I stepped onto the final landing at the top of the last flight from the bottom, I turned to face the door. From my position, for a fraction of an instant, I saw someone move away from the window. It was so fast, my brain didn't register hair color, skin color, or clothing. There is literally nothing distinguishable other than a human shape, leaning away from the window. I thought it was my mom peeking while waiting to startle me, as she does that sometimes for funnies. When no one peeked again, I slowly made my way down and pushed the door open. I round the corner, and she's at her desk. I fill her in, and she just nods. It happens all the time. It's very hard to describe what happens and when it happens. You see movement. But there's nothing there. But how can nothing move? It's mind-bending to see what you thought was a head of red hair moving between two shelves only to dissolve in midair before your brain even gets its shit together. Then, of course, there's the touching. I should note that it isn't confined to the basement. You could be on the second floor in the World Wars exhibits and feel someone run a finger up the back of your arm. Other times it's not in your mind, and you'll actually get a push. To sum up, I am a very logical person. I believe in science and am very grounded. But I grew up being shielded from dark forces by my Baptist elders and have spent my whole life bathed in superstition and witnessing shit like you wouldn't believe. I believe we live in reality. But I don't think we, as beings, are fully attuned to what reality is. I think we only see a narrow, vertical slice of the real world. We rub elbows with gods and demons every day without even knowing.